So thank you for coming, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I had been invited to come before, and part of the reason that I didn't come before was I didn't know that I had a subject that actually would be suitable for, I think, this audience, and so we had a nice coincidence of interest, so that I've been spending some time thinking about the Google Booksearch settlement, which actually has not been approved yet. So Google announced with the Association of American Publishers and with the Authors Guild a proposed settlement last fall, and the comments, certain kinds of comments are due in early May. There'll be a hearing in June of this year, unless it's postponed, to consider the Booksearch settlement. So I'm going to raise a number of questions about it. So if these questions at all resonate with you, it's not too late for you to make some of your views on it heard before the court. So I'm going to try to ask and answer a series of questions. So the first question I'm going to address is, why was Google sued over the Booksearch project, and how good was its fair use defense? Because that was the main issue in the case. Second, what motivated the settlement of the lawsuits, one brought by the Authors Guild and one brought by 5 publishers against Google for copyright infringement. What benefits will the settlement bring about? And I don't want to neglect that subject, but I want to then move on to some risks, disadvantages, or possible problems with the settlement, and after that talk about what can the judge do, and then insofar as there are sort of things that are really not within the purview of what the judge can do, who else might be able to do something, and to address the problems that I'm going to discuss. So a little bit of background. I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly because I'm sort of assuming that many of you in the audience know the background, so I'll try to move through that pretty fast. Google began the Booksearch project in about 2004. As all of you know, Google made arrangements with a number of major research libraries, including prominently University of Michigan, and a number of other libraries, including Stanford and Oxford. And the idea was Google would come and it would scan the books, and libraries would get back scanned copies of the books in their collection, but that Google would be building this Booksearch repository of books from all kinds of different libraries. But so only Google would have the entire corpus. At the moment, the corpus is about 7 million books. About 1 million of those is in print and in copyright. Another 1 million or so are in the public domain, and 5 million roughly are both in copyright but also out of print, and that's the part of the corpus that's of particular interest. Google is at least publicly saying that they're aiming to expand this the scanning project and to kind of get 15 million books maybe in the repository by the time that they kind of stop that part of the expansion. For books that are in the public domain, actually now with the Booksearch engine, you can get the whole book and you can download it and make whatever uses that you want to make of it. As for books that are in copyright, right now Google makes snippets available to people in response to queries, but it hasn't run ads against that so far because it thought that that would actually jeopardize its fair use defense. But it provides links so that if you want to buy the book, there's a place to go and do that. And then for publishers and authors as to books that they're willing to make more information available, you get more than snippets. So there's a partnering project with author-publisher groups that actually allows them to opt into sort of a broader access. So that's the kind of background about both the project and also the kind of current status of the access terms. The Authors Guild brought a lawsuit against Google in 2005, so it was the Authors Guild and a few of its authors sued Google for copyright infringement for unauthorized scanning of these books, storing and processing the scanned books and displaying parts of the books in a systematic way, arguing that that's not only copyright infringement, but also that the Authors Guild and its 3 members who brought the suit were part of a class of all authors whose books were scanned who would object to this scanning. Google's main defense in the case was that its scanning was fair use. It was scanning in order to make an index, in order to provide these snippets, and those acts it thought were fair use. It also disputed whether or not the Authors Guild was an adequate representative of the class of all authors whose works were in this research repository. There was then, a few months later, a lawsuit brought by 5 publishers. But this was not a class action, and in fact still isn't, although it will become a class action if the settlement happens, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now the question, the sort of second question that I put is how good was Google's fair use defense? And I think this is a place where you'd have to say copyright law is not so straightforward and clear on this subject that it's easy to say with confidence. I think they would have won a fair use defense, but it's important to sort of understand that, especially given that the case was pending in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in New York, and some of the decisions that the publishers and authors were relying on are Second Circuit precedents, there was more risk for them in this lawsuit because it was pending in a jurisdiction where some lawsuits that had rejected fair use defenses that arguably were similar had been rejected. So here's kind of what, from the publisher Authors Guild perspective, the fair use defense looked like. Well, Google has a commercial purpose for doing this. It's non-transformative, right? So the Supreme Court has said that when you transform something like a parody does, that's actually more likely to be fair use. If it's a non-transformative use, there's an argument that it's not fair use. From this, so commercial purpose, non-transformative use were 2 of the factors they were relying on. It was also a systematic, right? You weren't just scanning a couple of books, you were scanning millions of books, and sort of by the time you kind of just say millions, it kind of sounds like might be copyright infringement. You were copying the whole of the work, and you were storing it permanently. You weren't just time shifting, as in the Sony Betamax case. Copyright law typically presumes harm if you have a commercial purpose and a non-transformative use. So while the authors and publishers were also arguing that there was this new market for licensing this kind of thing, they also could just rely on the presumption. So from their standpoint, every single part of the fair use analysis goes against Google's case. Okay, so what does the fair use defense look like on Google's side? Well, they actually argue that it's transformative. And it's transformative in their view because there are a number of cases, mostly in the Ninth Circuit, which is kind of the left coast. The Ninth Circuit cases have treated search engine scanning and making thumbnails, which is kind of like a snippet, available, kind of the scanning that's required to sort of make that image, is transformative because it's making something available in a different way than the original does. And those cases have also promoted, said that that Google and the other search engines were actually promoting public access to knowledge as a good thing, right? So that's that kind of counters the other perspective. Secondly, they make the argument that it's necessary to copy in order to make the index, in order to make snippets available, and so it's a kind of necessity type argument. That we're doing the whole thing, but we're really only making snippets available, and so that's actually, in their view, again, relying on some of these search engine cases makes it seem like it might be a fair use. And their argument on the kind of the harm factor, which often turns out to be really a key factor, is that there's market failure here, right? That it would be impossible, really, to get rights clearances try to track down the owners of the copyrights and get clearance to do a digitization for the 5 million or so books that are in copyright but out of print, and many of them were written 30 years ago, 50 years ago, many years ago, and the copyright's still alive, but it would be so expensive to try to track down the rights holder that the right thing to do is scan it, make the snippets available, and if a copyright owner of one of those books objects, then Google will take it down, right? So if you don't want to be in the repository, fine, they'll take it out just like that. So that's then kind of their argument, and on the harm factor, they also were saying, hey, we're going to revive the market for a lot of these books, and so that's actually going to be in favor of authors, and so, and they also are making arguments that a lot of authors actually want their books to be more accessible. They want people to know what they learned, and so that's kind of the diametrically opposed view, right? On the one hand, the publishers are saying, every factor cuts against fair use, and on Google's side, every factor cuts in favor, and the judges would have to decide which side of that coin to do. So one of the reasons, okay, now to the third question, what was the motivation to settle? Well, one thing that's clear is litigation is really expensive, and it's not only expensive, but it takes a lot of time. And Google wants to get on with it. Right? So one of their motivations is, let's get rid of one expense. Let's sort of make this happen now as opposed to wait for a long time. And that's not, of course, the only thing. They were facing the risk of very high damage award against them. And settling this lawsuit for $125 million is like, ka-ching, a piece of change to them. And so it's a really cheap way to get a license to essentially 7 million books. Good thinking. Okay, so some part of the reason to settle then is that the outcome was not clear, even though I think they had confidence in that fair use defense, and I think they would have prevailed, but it was not clear. And you know, from the Authors Guild and Publishers standpoint, a motivation to settle was that it was unclear for them too, and so they might not end up with anything. So a settlement means that they get something. Also, it was far from clear that the class, right? The Authors Guild is saying we represent all authors of all books that are in the registry, and Google would have fought tooth and nail against the certification of that particular class. And so from their standpoint, they get a class certification out of this. Not only does that benefit them in terms of sort of the reward that they will get for settling this particular lawsuit, but it also strengthens their hands the next time they want to bring a lawsuit against some other technology upstart because, hey, we got certified last time, so we must be certified this time. You see, this is a very clever move here. Okay, but I think to be fair to all the litigants in this case, the settlement also really created the opportunity, at least for them, for what they regarded as a win-win-win, right? So Google then gets a license. It can essentially commercialize the Booksearch repository. And there are going to be revenues that are going to be flowing to the authors and publishers. And there's the settlement calls for the establishment of a book rights registry, and authors and publishers of books whose works are in the repository will be able to get compensation, not just out of the $45 million that was set aside to settle this lawsuit, but going forward, Google has committed to providing 63% of any of the revenues that it gets from the Booksearch settlement to the Book Rights Registry to pay out to the various people who've registered their works with the registry. So I think that that was, you know, the publishers and authors have been kind of looking at the digital networked environment and going, right, there's a kind of concern about Napsterization, and they tried for a while to do digital rights management technologies, and they want to lock everything up so that every time you look at something, you have to pay ka-ching, ka-ching. And consumers actually didn't like that very much, you know, as compared with that and like real books win, okay? So, so they've kind of been a little slow off the block. So here comes Google, right? Technology savvy and really good at marketing, and they say, hey, these guys invented some new business models for us. That's really great. So again, core of the settlement, Google has to pay $45 million into a fund that the Book Rights Registry will then distribute to authors who provide information by registering with this newly created Book Rights Registry. Google will spend $34.5 million to establish the Book Rights Registry so that it can get off the ground. So the authors and publishers that sign up with the Book Rights Registry then are eligible for a $60 per copyright owner payout for the scanning. That's already been done. And then there are 3 sources of revenues contemplated in the first 5 years that will then bring more money to the Book Rights Registry. So one is that Google will, after the settlement is approved, run ads next to Booksearch queries, and so they will now get ad revenues from that. And so to the extent that the books are in copyright and covered by the class action settlement, that money will then be split, 37% to Google, 63% to the Book Rights Registry. And then Google will also essentially open up a new store for books, so you can individually purchase books that are in among the 7 million in the Book Rights, in the repository, in the corpus. But you can only, you buy them, but you can only access them in the cloud, right? So you have to essentially be logged on, right? So they call it a purchasing program, but of course it's really a licensing program. So you can buy individual books and kind of have your library inside of the Google Cloud, and those revenues will similarly be shared in the way that I just talked about. And then most importantly, Google will also sell subscriptions to the corpus to institutions, whether they be kind of IBM or University of North Carolina or whatever, right? So they will then essentially license subscriptions to institutions, and that same kind of revenue stream will then be split in the way that I talked about before, and Google will then continue to scan books to kind of add further to the repository, and so that's the kind of the core part of what the settlement is really about. Now, what happens with libraries? Well, actually, there are a number of really interesting dimensions to this. The libraries that contributed books to the corpus will get back from Google a digital copy of those books, but not any other books. generally speaking. And one of the things that actually is good for the libraries that were participating in the scanning project is that some of them were facing exposure too, right? If Google lost this lawsuit on fair use defense, the libraries might get sued too. It was easier, they thought, to take down Google first and then extract from libraries thereafter. So one thing that will happen if the settlement is approved is the libraries that were sticking their necks out will kind of be able to kind of hold their neck firmly again without worrying about getting a noose around it. Public libraries actually will be given one terminal each for accessing the corpus, but you can't print anything out and you can't make copies of it. Many research libraries, I think, will become institutional subscribers to the corpus, and when you do that, you'll be able to view the whole work that's in the corpus. But you'll only be able to print out a small number of pages. So the kind of all the details are in the agreement if you want to take a look at it. But there's no special deal for public school libraries or for special libraries or for government libraries. So so there's kind of, in some sense, there's a layering effect in respect of the terms that are available to libraries. Now, what are the benefits of the Booksearch settlement? One for sure is that it removes a dark cloud of liability from the heads of Google and the cooperating libraries. There's unquestionably going to be more public access to books, and books that are from major research libraries than if Google had never started this project to begin with. An important benefit, actually, is that for the books that are in copyright but out of print, instead of just making snippets available as is currently the plan, or currently the practice, Google would now make up to 20% of the work available when you respond to the query. So that's actually a pretty big deal in terms of enhanced public access. And one of the things that Google actually believes, and I think many of the people in this room would also believe, which is to dispute the notion that just because books are out of print doesn't mean that they're irrelevant, right? And so I think that Google rightly thinks that things that today might be called orphan books, right? Books that are out of print, in copyright, but where it's difficult to track down the rights holder, that there's actually real value in those books and that people will want to have access to them and they will want to interact with them, and once they kind of get some value out of them, they might want to purchase them. And so in some sense, it will give new life to a lot of books that otherwise would kind of remain in these obscure venues. Another benefit, I think is fair to say, is that there will be revenues flowing to authors and publishers. I have no problem with the idea that authors and publishers of books that are in the corpus might want to share in the revenues. And those authors and publishers that don't want their books in the corpus can get them removed, right? So there's, you don't have to be in the corpus if you don't want to. And another value to the settlement is more consumer choice, right? So right now we don't have some of the choices that would be available to us, and so new business models, new choices for consumers, I think, are all in the benefits of the project. So what's not to like? Finally, I find 6 things to be worried about in respect to the Booksearch settlement. So I'm going to name the 6, and then I'm going to go through each of them one by one. Okay, one is that Google is in effect going to get exclusive rights to all the orphan works. Okay, so I'll explain in a minute why that's true, but it's essentially an exclusive right to all orphan books ever published in the United States of America. And it's a deal that nobody else can get, and it's a compulsory license. It's very interesting. Privately negotiated compulsory license. Cool. Second, other mass digitization projects which other people might want to undertake are arguably imperiled by Google essentially capitulating on the fair use defense that it said that it was standing up for. Three, the settlement will create two complementary monopolies, the Google Booksearch repository as a commercializing entity, and the Book Rights Registry, which will essentially be the clearinghouse for all the books, and they will have the power to set prices and other terms for access to those books. Four, the Book Rights Registry will have interests that are different, in my view, from the authors whose books make up the bulk of the repository. And so there's a kind of lack of representativeness issue that I think is troubling here. Five, there are no privacy guarantees. So because you're going to buy the books and they're going to be in the cloud and you look at the books in the cloud, there's some privacy issues, right? You like to think that when you read a book that it's nobody else's business what you read and how long you read it and what you read next and so forth. And Google at this point, there's nothing in the settlement agreement that essentially guarantees privacy interests for consumers. And six, and this is probably not worth mentioning, but it still is like, I don't like it, is that the class action lawyers in the case are going to get $45.5 million for settling the lawsuit. And you go, whoa, okay, they get more than the authors, okay? All the authors combined don't get as much as the lawyers do for a couple of years' worth. That's pretty good. That's pretty good money. Okay, so let me talk about each of these in order. Okay, so the orphan works thing. The estimate that I've heard, and again, no one really knows how many orphans there are in the repository, but the sort of the estimates that I've been hearing are that something in the neighborhood of 75% of those 7 million books are orphans. Okay, so that's the bulk of the corpus because all the in-copyright stuff, right? It's easy for them to make either a partnering deal with Google or to say, take my stuff out. And so then there's the public domain stuff, but about 75%. And Google will be able to monetize that through these individual sales, subscriptions, and ads next to display. And the Book Rights Registry will not be able to license anybody else to scan orphan books because it only has the power to license uses of books for which it has registrants, right? Now remember, what we have is a class action. Class action, let's say, covers 5 million authors. Let's just say that as a raw number, right? Raw estimate. So when Google settles this class action, the class will settle as the 5 million authors of these books, but only about a tenth of those people is expected by Google to actually sign up with the Book Rights Registry. Okay, so actually most of the orphan authors won't show up, right, won't register with the Book Rights Registry, and therefore they don't get any revenues, right? So, and because they haven't registered with the Book Rights Registry, the Book Rights Registry can't license out something they don't own the rights to. But during the settlement of the class action, you see, they're now representing everybody as opposed to just the people who register with them. So by settling that, essentially Google essentially captures all the orphan books. And the only way, practically, that any other entity, whether it's Amazon on the one hand, or Yahoo on the other hand, or Brewster Kahl's Internet Archive, the only way that they would be able to get an equivalent license is to start scanning, get sued by a class action, and then hope that settlement would be available to them on the same terms. which sort of seems like a little risky, okay? So that Google has, right, through a very clever jujitsu movement, right, with the law, is using the class action settlement to get a license to the orphan books that no one else can get, okay? And that's really interesting. Okay, so, what are the implications for other mass digitization efforts? Brewster Kahle is not the only person who would like to scan a lot of these orphan work books, but you know, if Google tried this, got sued, and settled, right, from the standpoint at least of some people, it's going to look like, well, that shows that in fact it wasn't fair use. And the fact that Google settled sort of seems like, well, somebody else should not do this because, gee, didn't Google settle? And yeah, they didn't concede that it wasn't a fair use, but you know, actions speak louder than words, and so there's an argument that it actually jeopardizes the sort of fair use arguments that other people might make. And Google, actually, I've talked to Google's lawyers about this. They say, oh no, this won't be a problem at all. But you know, realistically, a lot of other entities might say that it makes things more risky. Also, the settlement may take some of the wind out of the legislative push for orphan works legislation, right? So there has been pending before Congress for a number of years a proposed law that would allow people to make use of some orphan works, and then if the copyright owner came along and said, I want you to take it down or I want some compensation, then there wouldn't be, you wouldn't kind of get, the book wouldn't get thrown at you. You might have to take it down, or you might have to pay some sort of fee, but essentially it would limit the damages that would be available against you if you did something with orphan works. Some people think that settling this thing will take some of the wind out of legislative push for orphan works legislation, and that might be of concern. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Book Rights Registry and Google in terms of terms and conditions. So Google will not be setting prices and will not be setting terms of access on its own. There's an elaborate process that's called for under the settlement agreement for them to have a colloquy about sort of setting what the prices are going to be. And Google, of course, is planning to use algorithms to set the prices of the books. So they have really high confidence in algorithms as a way of doing price setting. But all the terms and conditions essentially are going to be agreed upon by these two entities. Google is saying, oh, we'll price this to promote broad public access. But, you know, the way that things work, if you set up a monopoly and you're a for-profit company, maximization of profit is kind of usually a goal. And since the Book Rights Registry governing body will probably be populated by members of the Authors Guild and members of the Association of American Publishers, who are profit maximizers too, the kind of, you know, oh, it'll be gentle and everything will be good and we won't price you out of the market. You know, it just doesn't have a long-term persuasive power to me. So that's the thing that I'm worried about. Now, I think the Book Rights Registry will never complain that the price is too high. They'll never complain that the DRM is too severe. And they'll never complain that the terms of access in other ways, like how many pages can you print out, yada, yada, they will never complain that it's too restrictive. Their institutional bias will be to essentially maximize revenues and not tell the authors who might be, whose books are in their repository, hey, I want my book to be available in the public domain. I want it to be available on a Creative Commons licensing basis. It's like they don't have the institutional incentive to do that, and besides which, I know these people. I've known them for 20 years. They don't think that way. So that's to worry about too. And for researchers who want to actually do queries on the entire corpus to do kind of research projects, you gotta submit them to Google in advance, and you would get advance permission, and they won't do it for everything. There also are those kinds of terms already reflected in the agreement. And because if the things work the way that that I think the settlement envisions, there won't be any competition. So without any competition, there also is unlikely to be certain kinds of innovations that might happen if other people were doing it, and there won't be competition as to price, there won't be competition as to other terms, and that seems to me to be a structure which, even if you don't worry about it for the next 3 years, you might want to worry about it 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, because the logic of monopoly tends in a particular direction. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Book Rights Registry. The Book Rights Registry can license others, for example, Amazon, to scan and make books available as to the authors and publishers that have registered with them. But a question that I think is worth asking is, would they do that? Right? If they already have this monopoly arrangement with Google, like why would they do that to create competition with a corpus where they're getting 63% over here? And besides which, nobody, okay, one of the things that's in this, the settlement agreement is what's known as a most favored nation clause. What that means is that the Book Rights Registry is contractually forbidden from offering anybody else better terms than Google has, okay? So that both cuts down on the ability of somebody else to do it because they can't offer the Book Rights Registry any terms that would undercut that. Okay, then there's the unquestionable fact that the Book Rights Registry will be getting 63% of the revenues from these various uses of in-copyright but out-of-print books. As to books that were written by authors and published by publishers who are not registered with the Book Rights Registry. So, ka-ching, okay, this is a great business model. I didn't write those books. I don't own the copyright in them, but Google is going to give me 63% of the money that comes from this thing, and I get to sort of distribute it to the authors that did register with me, even though they're getting money for books they didn't write. And that's, wow, what a business model that is. Okay, and then I've already talked about the Authors Guild and AAP being cut. So there's going to be, the governing board is going to be half authors and half publishers. And I'm sure it's going to be Authors Guild and AAP people. But there's like no librarians, there's no scholars, there's no public interest, you know, advocates on the governing body. And so that's kind of interesting by itself. And I think that the Authors Guild and AAP just don't share the research values of the majority of the authors in the corpus whose works are being commercially exploited or will be exploited under the settlement agreement. And if you look at the history of collecting societies, they have a really lousy record in terms of monopolistic behavior. So why would you think the Book Rights Registry is going to be any better than the other ones that we've already seen? Most of them actually operate under consent decrees. And they spend a lot of money on themselves, and they have lots of reasons. So we're going to see $2 million salaries for the CEO really fast, because how else are you going to spend all that money? You know, it's like, what else? Okay, and then there's only two law firms involved in the case. Settlement is going to provide them with $45.5 million. They didn't work that hard, and I think it's also fair to say that Google would have fought tooth and nail against certification of either class if the case had gone forward. So there's a little bit of conflict of interest, right? Usually in a class action settlement, you can count on the defendant to say the class should not be certified. Here they said, ka-ching, I'm going to get an exclusive license that I couldn't get any other way. This is brilliant, okay? This is really brilliant. Okay. Okay, privacy. Libraries who supply the books to Google have a long-standing, as many of you do, sort of commitment to respecting the privacy rights of users of libraries, and anonymous reading, and a lot of librarians maybe wouldn't take a bullet, but they go to jail. Okay, they really have the kind of emotional commitment to respecting the privacy rights of patrons, but nothing in the settlement agreement speaks about the privacy interests of the users. And since Google will be selling these books to individuals that can only be read in the cloud, it's clear that they actually will be able to monitor and make profiles of what people are reading and use that for marketing purposes internally, and because we have such lousy privacy laws in this country, can essentially market that to other people too. And Google has been unwilling so far to make any public pronouncements about respecting privacy interests. So that's 6, okay? I think there's enough reasons here to say this isn't such a good idea. Okay, now litigants can't settle class action lawsuits without a judge actually looking at the settlement agreement. But the question that the judge asks when the judge is reviewing the settlement is not whether the settlement is in the public interest. That's not the question. Okay, the question is whether or not the settlement is fair to the class, right? And so the question, the judge, on the face of it, Google is happy with it, the publishers are happy with it, the authors are happy with it, revenues will be flowing, books will be available. You see that from the standpoint of on the face of it, it looks like the kind of thing that the judge would say, yeah, sure. So somebody who comes in and says, oh, hell will freeze over and these bad things will happen, are going to look like, just trying to defeat this kind of bold move by Google. And so that's actually the thing. So it's possible that some members of the class, right, of authors whose works are in the repository might come forward and object. But the problem is that the way the class actions work is usually if you object, opt out of the class. Okay? So if you don't like the terms, opt out of the class. Well, the real objection here is that the class actually doesn't represent the interests and the values of the people whose books are in the repository. That's the core thing. Now, if the judge actually came to believe that the class was not a genuine class and that the Authors Guild was not an apt representative of the class of authors whose books are going to be affected by this settlement agreement, that's a big deal, right? That's actually a basis on which the judge could say no to the settlement. This doesn't represent the interests of the bulk of the class, and it's also possible that some entities might intervene. So there are the kind of special way for people who are affected by the class action settlement to come in and say, Judge, this doesn't just affect the 2 parties or the 3 parties who are litigants in this lawsuit. It actually affects other people. It has spillover effects outside of this. So one could imagine, for example, Amazon or the Internet Archive coming in and saying, this is this exclusive license by private negotiation to the orphan books that actually is an abuse of the class action process. And so, but the judge basically has a kind of up or down, right, role. He either approves it or he disapproves it. Now, sometimes judges can say, I think this is pretty good, but it could use the following kinds of things. But the judges are not required to do that, okay? And they certainly can't change the settlement, right? Change the terms of the settlement. So that's really what's before us right now. So what are the other options? Well, if the settlement is approved, it's not the end of the debate about this necessarily, because antitrust authorities, for example, and consumer protection authorities like the Federal Trade Commission could monitor how the Booksearch thing is working out and if there is evidence of monopolistic practices or things that are harmful to consumers, then they could take corrective action by bringing lawsuits to challenge whatever the concern might be. And Congress could also pass legislation that allows mass digitization efforts by other entities in order to create competition as to the orphan works. And of course, the judge can also say no, in which case Google would once again become the champion of fair use in the courts, and it would challenge class certification, and I think it would win on that. So those are kind of the options now. So in conclusion, if it was up to me, I'd say no to this. If I were the judge, I would say no to it, and I would cite the 6 problems that I just talked about. The thing that, as I said, I don't worry about what this is going to be like in the next 3 years, okay? Because both Google and the Book Rights Registry are going to have every reason to want to make everybody feel comfortable and, you know, start relying, institutionally subscribe, buy your books, and then we'll raise the prices later. Because that's the logic, okay? Google said, oh, no, we wouldn't do that. It's like, I don't trust you that much. So that's the problem. So I think libraries may rue the day that this case settles, because if they have had problems with scientific and technical journal subscriptions, this is a license to all the books ever published in the United States. Okay, that's actually a bigger deal even than these specific journals on specific things. So I think one of the things that's inhibiting more active engagement by scholars and by libraries and by others in this settlement analysis is that you look at the thing, it's a couple hundred pages long, it's got lots of technically complicated things. You know, the barrier to entry just to understand it is really high, and I avoided it for months, and finally just found myself, okay, I have got to read this, and it's just like painful beyond words. But it's something that I think that it's, you know, the judge may approve it unless there are some well-crafted objections that are stated to it relatively soon. And so that's what I came here to say. Thank you. It's my understanding that we can take a few questions, so if anyone wants to either make a comment, and actually I'm happy to hear if you think that the Google Booksearch settlement is the greatest thing since sliced bread, because I would like to be in a better mood about it than I am. No. No. Yes, right. Well, I think that Robert Darnton, the librarian of Harvard, has written 2 very, very thoughtful pieces on the future of books and the Google Booksearch settlement and his concerns about it. And so if you don't already know what his position on it is, you might want to take a look at those. I think that some of the librarians that I've talked to from the UC systems have said, look, this is better than we could have gotten if there had never been Booksearch. And, you know, we're powerless. We really can't do much here. And we'll hope that, you know, some other mass digitization happens later so that there will be some competition. But they feel like, you know, they got something out of it. And actually, you know, UC, University of Michigan, and a few others of the participating libraries, get digital libraries of their collections, which is a pretty big deal for them. So they're getting better stuff out of this than, other, if you're a research library someplace in the middle of the country and you offer your books to Google, they might say, hey, we already scanned those books. Too bad for you. So there's I think there's a kind of, University of Michigan in particular is like, we're there. Now I have to say that the people that I've talked to at the UC system are somewhat more equivocal, and when they're not on the record, are more likely to say, oh, yeah, oh. So I think that there's less jubilance, shall I say, from even the participating libraries than might meet the eye. And over the weekend, or in the coming week, I'm planning to post a short paper about this called The Dead Souls of the Google Booksearch Settlement. And it tries to analogize the Booksearch project to Chichikovs going around the Russian countryside in the 19th century, buying up dead souls and then trying to get rich off them. Gogol's Dead Souls project failed because people realized that they were dead souls, and so his scheme fell apart. But this is Google's Dead Soul story is one where ka-ching, I'm going to be able to monetize all those things. So there are a number of entities and groups and individuals who've been commenting on this, and so it's certainly, and actually Google hasn't blocked the stuff yet, so so you can find other things. But I think it's good that libraries and other groups are actually trying to take some action about it. But really the future of books and the future of access to information is plainly at stake here, and so it's really worth taking some careful attention to. Yeah?
I think the sense of ambivalence that you described in the library community is very real, and thank you. And you may know the American Library Association has announced the intention of filing an amicus brief in the case, which will focus, it's my understanding, on the antitrust concern. What I wanted to ask you, I'm not just making a speech here, what I wanted to ask you is, you've made a compelling case that there's a real problem with the class certification here, and the way I heard you, even a sense that it may be collusive, in the sense that the defendant has an economic interest in not objecting to the certification of the plaintiff class. If that was the basis of an objection, is there any way that a judge could address that without simply blowing up the settlement? Because I think libraries are very concerned to not blow up the settlement for the reasons you've given. There are some real benefits. But I don't see how that could be addressed in a way that wouldn't destroy the settlement. And what I'm asking is, can the judge limit the settlement?
Without the orphan works, Google has no interest in settling. It's not facing that much of an exposure from the Authors Guild, and most of the publishers that sued them are actually participating in their partner program as to many of the books that they make available. So this lawsuit is really about orphan works. That's what it's about. And the question then is there any other way for that to happen? And the answer is, yeah, if Google wins its fair use defense and then everybody else can do mass digitization to do that kind of thing too. And then once they have the corpus and can make at least snippets available, that creates more incentives for entities to join the partnering program. And then Brewster Kahle and Microsoft and Amazon and anybody else who wants to engage in mass digitization of the orphan works, I think will be in a better situation than they're going to be if the settlement goes forward.
The registry sounds fairly familiar to me. I wonder if you might compare this to Sound Exchange, which was formed when the RIAA went to the copyright arbitration royalty panel and said, all these people playing our music and archiving it and doing all these things illegally in a legal way.
I don't think that actually was, that was not really litigated as a class action.
They did that as well. But non-members of RIAA still would have to collect these.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Sound exchange is now independent. How successful is that? Is that a model?
You know, I don't know. Well, I mean, you know, some people will say ASCAP, BMI, Copyright Clearance Center are, you know, are operating collecting societies, and some people think they're great examples and some people don't. What I do say is that the Book Rights Registry doesn't exist today. So it's hard to say they're monopolist, okay, because they don't exist. I'm not, again, concerned about what's going to happen in the first couple of years. But once network effects kicks in, there's no competition. And the logic of being a for-profit company and wanting to use your copyright to make a lot of money kind of kicks in, and that's when the terms and the price, I think, gets formidable. You know, in some sense, Sound Exchange is also a relatively new entity. I'm not sure that it's operating under a consent decree. ASCAP and BMI are, okay, and that's because they misbehaved before, and they then were sued by the Department of Justice. So that's, yeah, there's an analogy there. Yeah.
The libraries that have participated in Michigan and Dartmouth and so on, they take their electronic copies, right? What's prevent them from actually forming a consortium to be competitive?
The Book Rights Registry will sue them. I mean, it's possible. And it might be a nice, bold move to try, but you know, the Book Rights Registry will have, right, will come into court and say, we represent, blah, blah, blah. Now, they actually can't represent the orphans, right, the orphan authors. They can't represent the orphan authors because the whole point is they can only represent the people whose stuff. Now, you're right, Google will actually say, look, this is going to help orphan works a lot, okay, and it's going to help orphan works a lot because we will know if you haven't registered with the Book Rights Registry, then the presumption could be that if you didn't register and you're the copyright owner of one of the orphans in the corpus, then that's a true orphan, right? Because Google has made very extensive and very expensive efforts to notify members of the class and to encourage them to sign up with the Book Rights Registry. And they actually have a reason to want to say that this is a genuine effort that we're engaged in. We want those authors and those publishers to be able to get some compensation out of that $45 million that we've set aside. And in part, that's because it would legitimate the entire arrangement. Right? And so if authors and publishers say, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, then they'll sign up. And Google has actually made a commitment. So if more people sign up as authors and publishers who are entitled to compensation as members of the class, they'll actually make more than $45 million available, right? So they're just making an estimate that in the neighborhood of 550 or so thousand people might actually sign up. And if 1 million people do, then they're going to have to cough up some more money. But again, to get an exclusive license to all the books ever published in the United States, that's actually a pretty cheap price.
Is there any presumption that there would have to be a disclosure of who the registries were, or in fact, does that become another barrier to say, in effect, well, we don't have to tell you who they are, so you could be stepping on a landmine by, digitizing anything?
Yeah, so I've talked to Google's lawyer about this. I haven't been able to find the provision in the agreement that commits the Book Rights Registry to make that transparent. But when I've talked to Google's lead lawyer, kind of at least the public face lawyer, Alex McGilvery, Alex says absolutely this will be available. But you know, the way that frankly the way that collecting societies work, they hoard the data. So collecting societies in Europe and some of them in the United States, they don't provide that information available. So I think transparency as a requirement would be something that would make at least this argument that, oh gee, this is going to help this kind of orphan work effort. It would be more plausible if the transparency was for sure. I'm trying to, maybe one more question? Yeah.
From a legal perspective, how do you establish the group like the office building of the same if you work in corporations, you don't let all the authors and you establish that the office building is very confident. What sort of reasons?
Well, you know, I'm not a class action lawyer, so but the basic concept of the class action is that there are many people as to whom this particular defendant did the same thing, and the questions of fact and the questions of law are the same, and therefore me as the named plaintiff am holding myself out as essentially a fiduciary, right? A kind of a responsible entity representing the interests of the class. Now, if in fact there are differences in the interests of the people who purport, you know, who are said to be the class, right? That in fact some of those people don't object to this, or they've made some sort of contractual arrangement outside of this, then it makes it harder to certify the class. So class certification is usually the most important thing that happens in a class action lawsuit. Once a class is certified, it's not a guarantee of winning, but you see that once you certify the class, the judge is capable of awarding all of the money that the class could have gotten individually if they brought individual lawsuits. Okay, so the exposure that firms are the exposure of the firm that's facing a class action lawsuit, unless they're really sure they're going to win, can be tremendous, right? And so that's why you throw a fair amount of money at the class action lawyers, and then you make set aside some money for the class, and you get on with your business. And class action lawsuits often settle the day after a class is certified. Okay, thank you.